Good. This is Chairman Victor Jones here today for the Wednesday, May 18th meeting of the City of High Point's Public Safety Committee. Present with me today are Councilman Tyrone Johnson, Councilman Britt Moore, Councilman Chris Williams. We've got one agenda item, that is item 2022-255. It'll be a discussion on decriminalization of code of ordinances. Staff will be presenting.
So today we have with us Nick Tosco, who is a partner at Pointer Sproul, which is one of our outside firms that I think you guys are familiar with that we've used throughout the years. This is a rather large undertaking that our office has been working on with Nick from Pointer for probably about almost 6 months now. So in late 2021, the North Carolina legislature passed Session Law 2021-138, which is known as Senate Bill 300. And this was a very large omnibus, generally police reform, criminal justice law that had many, many parts. And one of the parts in it that was really relevant to local governments was decriminalizing local government ordinances. So the presumption for years has been that prior to the legislation, it provided that a violation of any city ordinance was by default a misdemeanor unless the ordinance provided otherwise, which meant that there was a presumption under state law that local governments had the ability to enforce criminally if we decided to. So for lots of different violations, we would have the option to either proceed with civil penalties, criminal penalties, or criminal citation where they would then have to appear in court. And the presumption was that you could. So Senate Bill 300 shifted that presumption such that now under the new statutory language, the local government has to specify any violation that we wish to be criminally enforced. So the presumption just completely shifts for us to go through and add that language that it may be criminally enforced to every part of our code of ordinances, which is rather lengthy, that the city may want to ever criminally enforce. So as you can imagine, it is a huge undertaking. So this law was passed at the end of last year, and local governments throughout the state are kind of trying to figure out what this looks like and how to go through and review the whole code, decide what's appropriate to enforce and what isn't. Some local governments are doing it in stages where they're taking kind of section by section and doing it separately. We went through and engaged Pointer. They've helped a couple other jurisdictions across the state and did a comprehensive search of the entire code of ordinances. And so one other note is that in addition to shifting the presumption so that we have to go through and proactively say that it can be criminally enforced, it also had a list of parts of local government ordinances that are prohibited from being criminally enforced, so that we no longer even have the choice, but that the state law prohibits that. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Nick to give you guys a high-level summary. Go ahead.
Well, so before he begins that presentation, did the state give a timeline on when this had to start and finish? And if you've worked with other jurisdictions, has anybody completed one yet?
So the effective date was December 2021. And to our knowledge, most jurisdictions haven't completed this yet. We've talked about it on all of our, listservs for municipal attorneys. It was a topic at our winter conference where most jurisdictions, it's just such a big undertaking that, like I said, they haven't really started it yet, or they're doing it piecemeal. So we've been working since December to do a comprehensive review. Something that Nick will go through when we went through the process, but we consulted all of the relevant departments. We worked with the police department, we worked with planning and zoning, public services, all of the departments that would have any desire to have parts be criminally enforced, and got their input on it.
Is there any state funding that comes to help pay for this?
No. This is a change that we're having to do because it's required by state law for us to go through and do it. And there was even to even go further back from before the law was passed, the legislature for a number of years has been looking at this. In the 2020, I think 2019 and 2020, all local governments had to submit a list of the ordinances that they did criminalize. They did an inventory across the state, and we had to do that, so that they could kind of see what local governments were criminalizing and what they weren't. And after taking that inventory is how this ended up in Senate Bill 300 and deciding, to basically shift the burden, to put the burden on the city to go ahead and criminalize it instead of a presumption that it was criminalized.
I'll say one more thing, then I won't say nothing else. Well, until the next time. I would be interested in, keep a log as we go through the process, and when it's done, if I'm still on council, let me know how much it cost.
Well, hopefully it will be done shortly.
That's fine. I still want to know how much it costs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because as you can imagine, like I said, it was a really big undertaking.
I got it.
Even just putting our code together, we
Got it.
didn't have a single document that had our entire code. Muni code is what houses all of it. So that we could start by just doing search functions and looking for criminal and penalty, to do this inventory. It was a big undertaking. And so I can kind of turn it over to Nick for that. And the other thing is that the clerks have uploaded to your OneDrive the summary document as well as the red line of the Code of Ordinances, which is 236 pages. So we have that red line so you can see the changes and see the comment boxes on how we made the decisions that we did. And then once we come through and have the discussion and hopefully favorably move this from the committee to city council, we'll finalize the document to a clean version. So anything else, Chair, before I turn it over to Nick? Okay, Nick.
All right, good afternoon. Again, Nick Tosco with Pointer Sproul. Thank you all for having me and for taking a look at this. It's not the most exciting thing that you'll do today, but it's important. And I just want to start off by commending your staff, Greg, Megan, Brian Beasley, Robbie Stone. These folks are working really hard to make sure that you all are in compliance with the state legislation, and I just wanted to commend them for their work. So I'm going to try to be as brief as I can on this. I know it can get dense very quickly, and like Megan said, there has been a lot of process to this, but my goal is to try to make sure that we inform you about what was done leading up to this point, just so that you kind of are aware of how we got to to this current draft, and then just to kind of go over the draft with you as quickly as I can. I did want to follow up on on your question about the timing. Megan is correct that the effective date for the legislation was December of 2021. However, the way that we've kind of decided to deal with this, and we consulted with Brian Beasley, who's here as well with the police department, is that essentially it does not say you must change your ordinances by December of 2021. What it says is it becomes effective, meaning that it is not a good idea to criminally enforce a violation of the ordinance after that date until you have revised your ordinances. And so that's a little bit of a distinction there. It's not as if our ordinances have expired, so to speak. It's just that we want to get it kind of fixed so that when there is a criminal enforcement for a violation of the ordinance, that we're in a good place to do it. And I should just say, I don't know how familiar you are with civil versus criminal enforcement, but it may be helpful because I had to learn this process a little bit in working with Brian and others, that what we're talking about when we say civil versus criminal enforcement. So you'll see throughout the code, there are several places where there are civil penalties or civil remedies is what they're called in legal sense. And that just means that, that the city attorney's office can pursue civil action in civil court to try to get somebody to comply with your code of ordinances. So that's the civil side of things. This deals with criminalizing the ordinance. And there are several places, like Megan said, there was a presumption, pretty much the entire code could be criminally enforced. And what does that look like? What is that? Well, that typically, and Brian's here and he can speak to it a little more because he educated us on this, is a police officer being called out for a violation of the ordinance and writing a citation, a criminal citation that says you are in violation of this ordinance, you need to appear in court, have a hearing, and then there's a criminal penalty associated with that. That criminal penalty that they would pay to the court, is that correct, Brian? They would pay that to the court, not to the city. Those criminal penalties then go to the school boards, because under North Carolina law, criminal penalties, the money received for that, after, they pay kind of the administrative expense to the city, those go to the school boards, not to the city. So, but for civil penalties, and when it's made clear that it's only civil penalties that we're dealing with, that can go to the city. And so that's just kind of, I wanted to just draw that distinction between civil and criminal enforcement, and we can answer any questions you have about how that works, but it's kind of helpful when we're going through and saying, okay, this is criminal, this is civil, what that means and what the difference is. So Megan did a good job of giving you the backlog on the legislation and what we need to do in order to come into compliance with this. I'll just give a quick procedural background of what we did. So, and this is in your summary document as well. What we did, we started by taking your whole code from Unicode, which, as Megan said, there was not one entire compendium of all the ordinances together, but we created that. And then we just did a search where we, searched the terms that anywhere where there could be a criminalized section of your ordinance. We pulled that together into one document, and that's the document that you have before you. And then we went through, and the first thing we did is anywhere where the legislation says you cannot criminalize this, we just took it out. Just deleted it because the legislation's clear, you can't criminalize certain things. Then after we did that, we identified those sections that are currently criminalized, but we worked with staff to determine whether they should stay criminalized because they can be under the legislation, or whether it makes sense to decriminalize them still. Even though the legislation doesn't require us to, we went ahead and did it because it's not something that you would typically think of as a criminal penalty. And it's also to ensure that if the city is spending the time, enforcing this ordinance, that money would then be returned to the city and not have to go to the school boards. So that's the first kind of legislative step we took. Then what we did is we incorporated all those revisions into a draft that we then sent out to the different staff departments that Megan alluded to, and worked very closely with Brian Beasley with the police department to make sure that what the police department is doing from a criminal enforcement lines up with what our ordinances actually say. And then after we did that, we had a kind of revised, I did want to say, sorry, I'm jumping around, but I did want to say that one of the things that we did with the police department, and this is kind of a nuance that I just wanted to explain so when you're reading through the draft, you understand it, is that there are statutes that make certain violations a crime. And so there's the option when a police officer goes to see if a violation of the ordinance is occurring, he can write or she can write a citation for the statute instead of the ordinance. And that would, and then the district attorney would then prosecute that under the statute. So for the areas where the police department feels comfortable writing the criminal citations, based off of the statutory violation, then we just left that and we didn't criminalize the ordinance because there's no need, because it's covered under the statute. So we identified those and we put those in the draft too, just so that we're all on the same page that those are being taken care of by the statute. After we got that kind of decriminalized, criminalized section together, the final thing we did before we, put it out there for all the city managers and everyone to look at is we did some cleanup work, is what I'll call it, which is just while we were in there decriminalizing and criminalizing, we made, excuse me, we made some revisions just to standardize, make things consistent, fix typos, things like that. And you'll see those when I get to the legend of the different coloring, I'll explain that. So once we finished with the cleanup work and we finished with the decriminalizing and criminalizing, then we dispersed it to the city managers and to the other staff members and gave it, had them look at it. And then we had a meeting, and I forget when the meeting was, but it was not too long ago that we met and made sure everybody was on the same page about what we were criminalizing, what we were not decriminalizing from a staff perspective. Once we got that draft together, then we made a few more just kind of finalization edits, things like that. And that's what you have before you. That's kind of the high level. Throughout this process, we've been consulting with other jurisdictions. We met with the City of Greensboro's police attorney about how they're handling it. We've met with other folks to try to make sure that we were all on the same page. So that's kind of a high level overview of the process. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the process before I dive into the document itself, if you have any.
Not at this point.
Okay. Well, then, Megan, is it all right if we just jump in? Okay. So you'll see in the summary document that we provided to you, there's the last two sections, summary of proposed revisions and a legend for the draft code. Do you all have that? I just want to be sure.
If it's in OneDrive, I came from a work job, I don't have my computer.
Okay.
That's all right.
So the summary it basically just gives a high level by, chapter of what we did, whether we criminalized, decriminalized certain sections, whether we did cleanup, et cetera. The legend that's at the end of the document, we basically, in order to ease, because it's a large document, in order to make sure that you all were aware of what we were doing, instead of reading every word, what we did is we highlighted on a section by section basis. The red means that we recommended, when I say we, I'm referring to Pointer School, but also the staff collectively, our consensus. If there's a red highlight, we recommend not criminalizing, either because, it needs to be decriminalized under the legislation, or like I said before, because it just doesn't make sense to create this, make this a criminal penalty for a violation of this kind of ordinance. So that's in
Stop you
red.
right there.
Yeah.
So you're using the red to show us what you are changing to not criminalize, right?
Correct.
But you referenced earlier, there are things y'all have already taken totally out that are not even there for us to see what was taken out. Is that correct?
No, you'll still see it.
Yeah, you'll see it.
It's just highlighted different. Okay,
So
we'll see where you took it out.
Well, it took it out, meaning decriminalized it because the law requires.
Oh, so that's what you're referring to in
Yes.
that language. Got you.
yes, yeah,
Okay. I thought you
everything.
meant there were things that were literally taken out. Okay.
No, yeah, everything you'll see, it's like track changes, like a red line. So everywhere we've taken out criminal language, meaning decriminalized, you'll see a strike through.
Gotcha.
But we also highlighted the section just so that you don't have to read through and say like, is this a decriminalization or a criminalization? We made the decriminalization red for you.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then the criminalizing, where we went in and added language to criminalize, or it was already criminalized and we're keeping it criminalized, that's in green.
Okay.
So when you're looking through it, that's kind of the legend. And then if the only thing we were doing in the section is cleaning it up, doing the consistency, things like that, that's in yellow. And so if you don't see any highlighting in there, that means that, it's a section that you can't criminalize or decriminalize, how to cite to the code, or, sections like that you can't have a criminal or civil penalty associated with it. So that's kind of the legend, and I guess, I don't know, Megan, what's the best way? Should I just go through the summary
Yeah.
and then,
Maybe just go through the summary so they have an idea of like the sections of what, fire prevention, emergency management, that sort of thing,
Okay.
that were relevant.
sure. Okay, and so the summary of revisions, I'll just say at the front, this is just where a change was made. If we left something alone, we didn't include it in the summary. It's just where something was getting taken out or something was being added. So the first chapter is like the general use and construction of the code, where you have the definitions and you have the general civil penalties and the general criminal penalties. And so the way I like to think of it is it's kind of like an umbrella where the top, this first section here is what says this is a criminal penalty and this is a civil penalty. And then everything else kind of refers back up to that very first section. It says, in accordance with section 1-1-4. That's the main section that is either civil or criminal. And so we significantly changed that chapter. So, I would encourage you to take a look at that. While we were in that chapter, and that section, specifically 1-1-4, where we said you can treat something as a criminal or a civil penalty, in addition to changing the language on the criminal side, we also changed the language on the civil side while we were in it. And the reason for that is because all throughout your code, there's a difference in how you civilly enforce a violation of that ordinance. So what we did is try to standardize it by saying, here's what a notice of violation has to have. Here's how you deal with a civil penalty. Here's what happens if there's an appeal of a notice of violation or a civil penalty. And so there's kind of a standardized process that I used other jurisdictions, kind of standardized processes, and kind of created one for you there. And so it's pretty typical. It's not anything crazy. So if you would take a look at that, and as long as you're comfortable with it, it could be a good thing for creating uniformity, so that anytime staff is dealing with a civil penalty, they're doing it the same way. You're having the same appeal, same penalties, same NOVs, that type of thing. And so that's the first section. The second, and I'm saying section, I'm meaning chapter, but the second is Chapter 2, Article C, which is vehicle lease and rental taxes. That was just one section that we decriminalized because it's covered under a statute. So we didn't need to criminalize that anymore. The next is fire prevention and protection. There was a criminal penalty for having a telephone alarm system operated the wrong way. Again, we just didn't think that rose to the level of a criminal penalty. And so staff agreed and we decriminalized that. Emergency management, that was another one where it was already covered. I believe that was state curfews. We just went ahead and decriminalized it because it's covered under statute. And just stop me if you have any questions about this. I can turn to that section if you do. The next one is streets and sidewalks, Title VI, Chapter 1. One of the things that you cannot criminalize under the legislation is the regulation of trees, which is very broad, but so anything that just smelled of regulating trees, we just went ahead and decriminalized. And so there was a placement of hedges section that we decriminalized. Chapter 2, solid waste collection and disposal. We worked with the Public Services Director, Robbie Stone, and went through there and just said, okay, what needs to be criminalized, what needs to be decriminalized. And so we did that. While we were in it, Robbie had some requests of cleanup things. So you'll see that in yellow where we highlighted those sections yellow because we need to clean that up. Minimum housing code. This one is a little bit of a tricky one. There's several things in the legislation that are unclear, and we talked about this at the Municipal Attorneys Conference. We've been talking about it at the listserv. The legislation says you can't decriminalize anything where the authority to regulate this is based off of the planning and development statutes, 160D, unless it deals with unsafe buildings. And so we're like, well, what does that mean, unsafe buildings? So we did the best we could. This is a question that all jurisdictions across the state have. We did the best we could. We went through, and anywhere where it seemed like we were dealing with an unsafe building violation, we said that no criminal penalty unless it deals with the unsafe building. We basically just parroted the statute, and there is a definition of unsafe buildings in the statute, and we just kind of referenced that to take care of that issue. Regulation of abandoned and junk motor vehicles. Again, there's authority for that under state statute. So we kept that criminalized under state statute. Abandoned structure code, we decriminalized all those sections except for the ones where you're dealing with an unsafe building. And again, we just referenced the statute on that. Title IX, Article K is trash, debris, and dilapidated, outdated buildings code. Again, we decriminalized it if the authority was under the planning and development statutes, unless you're dealing with unsafe buildings, and then we reference the statute on that one again. Title 10, transportation and traffic. This is one we worked significantly with Brian and the police department on because there are a lot of traffic violations that we wanted to make sure are covered under state statute. And if they're not covered under state statute, we wanted to make sure we kept those criminal so that they can issue tickets for that. Title 11, Chapter 2, taxi cab is related to taxi cab violations, and that is one of the areas for some reason that is you can't criminalize those. So if they relate to the taxi cab driver, so we decriminalized that where we needed to and criminalized the other sections that are necessary.
Real quick, and you guys will recall when Fred Baggett was here a couple of weeks ago with the legislative update, that's a carve out that he's working on during the short session. He had written a letter on behalf of the chiefs of police and had talked to us about perhaps if our police department would want to have the option of criminal there, because that was one of the blanket prohibitions. So that's one that's kind of an asterisk gray area that we're following in the short session to see if anything happens with that.
Yep. And then Title 11, Chapter 6, massage establishments, and Chapter 7, sexually oriented businesses. We decriminalized the sections in Chapter 6 and 7 where the city likely derives authority under state law that cannot be criminalized, and then we criminalize the other sections that are able to be criminalized. And then Title 12 offenses, this is the last one, and this is the most lengthy one. So when you're going through, we saved the best for last. It's there are a lot of sections that the police department, and Brian can speak to this more. There are a lot of sections that are criminal, they enforce criminally. And so we had to go in and put in each section that needed to be criminalized, because before, the way that this title worked is it said, there was a section that said anything in Title 12 can be criminalized, and that was it. So we didn't really know, as we were going through section by section, is this something that was criminalized before or not? So we worked with Brian to try to figure out what are the police actually criminally enforcing of these. We made sure we put those in, and then the other ones that are covered under state law and we don't need to criminalize them, we left that so that, the police can just issue a citation based off of statute. And then when we were going through, we made some minor cleanup revisions there as well. So that's pretty much it. That's the summary of it. If there are certain sections or anything that you all had questions about, I'm happy to answer that. And Brian, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Okay.
So as you can see, it has been a lengthy process that we have vetted stakeholders to make sure that the recommendations where we did have any gray areas or areas where a judgment call would be made, as the attorneys, we said, here's where a judgment call needs to be made. We defer to the subject matter experts. We defer to police or public services. We had the manager's office weigh in as well. So, it's all been revised. There are just a couple of areas, like I mentioned earlier, that we're waiting to see how this law evolves and is enforced. One is specific to forms of amusement and entertainment. So we have a section that's like parades, picketing, special events, kind of a catch-all that would fall into that. And the Senate Bill 300 provides that an ordinance cannot impose a criminal penalty on any ordinance adopted pursuant to basically these sections. But the question is, what is, quote, a form of amusement or entertainment for a definition? Because we use different terms like picketing and protest and special events. So, there is certainly a gray area that we imagine will probably be case law that figures that out of what can be criminally enforced for those sections and what can't be. For example, parades, carnivals, festivals, block party, bicycle races, foot races, where exactly this specific event falls into the statutory language of forms of amusement and entertainment. So that's kind of a heads up area that we asked staff and management to weigh in on how they wanted to handle that. And there might be a jurisdiction where somebody challenges that and case law comes out of it and it gives us more guidance on how to handle it. And then the other area that Nick already addressed was the unsafe buildings, of just seeing exactly what all that encompasses. I think that perhaps case law will be developed if people challenge that. And if anything does develop, then we'll just come back and do another amendment and make the changes as appropriate. Regulation of taxis, we're waiting to see if anything happens with the work that Fred's doing in Raleigh. And I think those are probably the big ticket items that we kind of have a, short list to monitor and see how they develop. Because again, this is brand new. It's completely changing the way that local governments have structured their ordinances ever.
When's it end? No, I mean, is there, when is your work done here, and then you say we're done with this for now, and if there is that point, does it have to go back to Raleigh to be approved? Or
No,
or something?
nothing. City council is the final approval on the code of ordinances. And so hopefully our work will be done in the short term here. We're asking today that you move this forward to the full city council to review everything. Certainly, like I said, we have the red lines, still kind of red lines, so you can see what the changes are, but we're ready to turn that into a clean document. We'll be having a public hearing, actually, and there's a nuance to the law as well that this has to be introduced twice. So it'll come to you. Our plan is for the first meeting in June where it will be introduced to the full city council, and then the second meeting in June where it will be voted on. And then at that point, our work is done until anything else develops for these areas that are kind of gray areas and uncertain. Of course, we'll monitor if there's any technical corrections bill or anything like that in the future. Nothing like that has happened yet. Like I said, for example, the taxi cabs in the short session might happen, and we might have to come back with just a small amendment related to that. But our hope is that our work is done once city council adopts all of these amendments next month. And then it'll just be something that we monitor see how it develops.
Chairman, come on. But let me preface this and blame it on fatigue, and pretty much everything's gonna come out of my mouth and it's gonna be wrong. But just as an example, okay, if we go through the process, we approve it, and someone gets a permit to do something, a walk or something, and then it goes over into something else, and they actually like violate, like blocking traffic and things like that. So all that still can be, there's still an element that can go into criminal from civil, right? So that doesn't change something like that, am I correct?
Correct. And assuming if they would cite the ordinance or the statute, depending on what the offense is, right?
Yes, so in a situation like that, with the understanding that there is a gray area with forms of amusement, we're still proceeding as to criminalizing some of that to avoid that particular problem. Now, once they're impeding traffic, there's a state statute for that, so we can move on to those things. when we, or when Nick is talking about decriminalizing something, that takes away our ability to report criminally and make an arrest for it, but we can still cite him through civil penalties, still write him a pardon to, so to speak. So but the situation specifically that you're referring to, this will still be okay after that. It'll still be criminal if they violate the rules of the parade. And
Gotcha. What I was trying to get to is like what the steps would look like as we sort through, if things are, like you say, in the gray area. Like, I just want to kind of visualize what the steps would be that we would have to deal with it, instead of
And I
automatically falling into the,
Yeah, and by gray area, we've made a decision,
okay.
but it might be that somebody were to challenge that decision, and then the courts will make a decision on it, right? So we've erred on the side of still having criminal enforcement for some parts of, again, our language is parades, carnivals, festivals, block parties, bicycle races, foot races. So we've erred on the side of being able to give the police the ability to criminally enforce that, and then it would work through it. Then perhaps a citizen would challenge and say, no, you can't criminally enforce this. This is, unlawful. You should have just given me a civil citation. And then a court would make a decision, and then case law would develop, and then we would have an idea of what we can and can't do. So we've made a call on it, but it's just not been tested yet, because it's brand new.
That, you just answered my question. That's exactly what I wanted to know.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah. And that was something that was really interesting to learn. Of course, as Brian is the police attorney, he is the expert on police and enforcement. And so initially, we envisioned that we would, probably enforce a number of these things and make them criminal. But what Brian and Chief Stroud explained to us is that for most violations that have a state law, the officer is always going to pick citing to the state law because the district attorney is more likely to bring that case forward. Did I say that correctly? So, Brian and the chief said, you really don't need to, because we're always going to cite state statute for speeding, because that's what the district attorney is going to actually move forward with. They don't want to move forward with local government ordinance citations. And so that was also kind of an enlightening moment to understand, and I think perhaps that's part of what this omnibus legislation was to do, was not to have all of these different areas that could be criminalized. But we made those judgment calls, and we feel comfortable with them. And like I said, we vetted them through every department in City Hall that had any interest in it, and that the management made those decisions on areas that were a little more gray. And then we'll just see if case law develops through the court system for it.
Any other questions?
But so the net effect will be that a lot of the things that could have been criminal penalties, there'll be less of those.
Yes,
And
Yeah.
criminal penalties go to the schools.
correct.
These would come to us.
So we're taking the money from the children. Is that how that?
That's civil, right?
Well, yeah, so, and there's a clarification there too, that, in terms of the school boards, that's only if they go to court, and then there's a criminal penalty issued by the court, and then that money goes, right? Or there's a criminal penalty, is a criminal penalty that's issued. Most of the time, what we've understood from talking with the police department is that most of these things are civilly enforced. Most of these things, you're getting a notice of violation, hey, you're violating this ordinance. It's not so much that you're having to go to court for every little.
Well, this has been such a serious subject for 40 minutes. I was just trying to add some
Yeah.
levity.
I just don't want you on record that we're taking money from the schools. We're not doing that.
We would never do that, nor does the city attorney's office recommend that.
Get it out there, right?
I definitely think this has merit and warrants moving on to the full council. So I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Motion is second. Councilor Johnson, how do you vote?
Aye.
Councilor Moore?
All right.
Williams? Aye. Councilor Joseph, aye. That motion passes. There's nothing else for this board. We are adjourned.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you for your work.